Hello.
Hello. Ah, there you are.
Could you,
I went
can you
live on
believe?
my own here. Everybody can
Ooh,
spread out the everybody, and away we go. Make sure that's over there. That's over there. Blah blah blah, and
can
we
you
will
believe it,
drop that off.
RJ? Could you believe what he said? He would talk to Skepticon about us. Could you believe
Ah,
that?
well, you. I don't know whether he'll talk about me or not. I think he was meaning you.
I think he'll mention you too.
I've
Ugh,
been hoping to get.
phone.
PZ has huge, mega followers, and the more I can get some little commentary on that side from my shameless plugged end, the better. But anyway, that I thought was a useful conversation. I think it went nicely. We covered a lot of things. I suppose could have played a little bit more off of the issue of why it's just a waste of time to go after the damn flat earthers. They're funny. They're methodologically interesting. I don't make any claims about that they're not of interest, because if you want to figure out how somebody can believe something that's not true, Jeranism is an absolute test case of how somebody can manage to do that. But demographically, they're small potatoes. And the number of people online that just go overboard obsessing about them,
Yeah, the
huge.
the skeptic the skeptic community right now has like Armored Skeptic and those other guys, Logic, I think, they're all just going after the flat earthers, which is not necessary. They're
Yeah.
just
If they ever become prominent, if that one basketball player, I guess, who I think it was a basketball player who
LeBron James.
expressed support for flat Earth, if he ever runs for Congress, then fine and dandy. Or if he's made Secretary of the Interior, then by all means, we'll call attention to it. But until that happens, move over and pay attention to the people that are actually making bad decisions,
We are giving
whether it's
them,
a
yeah, we're
yeah.
almost giving. It's almost in a sense we're giving them a platform by bashing their ideas so publicly. I would say I would
Well,
say
that's
that.
always been the case. I mean, nobody argues that any of the flat earthers didn't get a boost
Right.
from the attention that in the lawsuit that Alfred Wallace had with him back in the 1860s or 70s. But still, there is a point where, for what you think is true, and you're willing to defend your position, and in a scientific frame, you're always willing to argue that evidence matters. Through reason and evidence, you can sustain things. And by the way, I think Wallace won the lawsuit. The point is he never got any money out of it, and la-di-da. But the same thing is that when I deal with idiots like Joe Cisnitsky or whatever his name is, I'm always mispronouncing it because it's like Mechikukukukukukuku, that I can never quite remember his name. But he's a lower echelon creationist. He's completely inconsequential. He doesn't affect anything, so I don't follow him. But whenever he pops up in a conversation and he's shooting his mouth off, I remind him of the polystrate source that he's never done. And so what I do then is you want to build up a repertoire of litmus tests and a repertoire of, in effect, a gotcha, where you can repeat a claim. Preacher is another one. If you've been following me on Twitter, I've been going a long joust with, I think he's called Online Gospel is his full thing, but the moniker is Preacher. And he's a sort of young earth creationist, but maybe not, and it's hard to figure out what is going on with him. And he'll repeat the same question again and again and again, and after you've answered it again and again and again, he'll keep on asking it again and again and again. And it's just, whoo. Well, I don't tire easily, as you may well know. I can work into the wee hours and all that sort of stuff when I get the bee into the bonnet, while I'm doing something else, multitasking I'm actually doing research while I'm doing the Twitter, because it's online. I'm doing research, and I feel I can joust with the guy. I'm quick-witted.
Oh, hey,
So
Apologia is asking you a question. He says, "What's your polystrate source, RJ?"
Aha! My polystrate source. Heavens, there are several of them. What was so funny about it is that there have been stuff, not the Brian Thomas, but it's farther back. In fact, let me do a little search to show you exactly what I was suspecting that this idiot would have done. which would have been to find some creationist sources on polystrates. And I put polystrate into my hashtag tip bibliography, searching, 9 results. That's there's a J.D. Mitchell polystrate fossil and petrified forest in 2011. An old from Creation Research posting from 2013, polystrate trees, flood burial and off from John McKay. So just from the creationist, and the 1999B Institute for Creation Research, polystrate trees and coal seams of Joggins fossil cliffs. That's John Morris, who's got his full geology degree. Michael Ord and Getchy 2007, polystrate trees. So you've got material that quotes whoop, whoop, as science sources that would be there, the thing he could draw on. And what was revealing about Joe, that he hasn't even done that. If he wanted to, he could even look up Woodmarap and whatever and troll the science sources that they used. Basically, it's material from the 1960s and earlier. I mean, it's really old stuff. And it's often difficult. It took me quite a while to trace down some of the background context of some of this stuff because it's kind of a non-issue. The Yellowstone material is basically about pyroclastic flows, and the Joggins Cliff formation stuff is also functionally some volcanic deposits where stuff gets buried because there was an active volcano nearby at the time. And that's usually what forms these things. Then there's some oddball ones that basically show up in 19th century stratigraphy reports that are often in some foreign language. There's some stuff in France and that where there's supposedly kind of a log that's buried on the side, and there's an illustration that's from an old journal that was done by hand. I mean, this is not, and a few photographs of the turn of the century. There's very sparse. And so you basically got to end run search on the fields where they are to try to find out what's happened. And some of this stuff may not even exist now because, they probably put a road cut through there in 1920 or World War II happened in between, and you don't even have any information. For the same reason that, it's the Java man fossils are all gone because they were blown up. Peking man fossils. They were lost during World War II. All we have are the casts.
It was just Homo erectus, wasn't it?
Judging from the cast, there's no reason to, and of course we found tons of fossils since, which is why anybody that tries to trot out the fact that jump in.
Oh, have
You're
you
about ready to jump in.
I saw someone was talking about Kent Hovind in the chat I was scrolling through, and then you mentioned Peking man or Java man. That reminded me of, you've seen, I know we've talked about it before, the tract Big Daddy. I know we mentioned
Biloxi River tracks.
No, the tract, the chick tract.
Oh, tract. Oh, the Big Daddy tract. Yeah.
So, you're familiar with his the fossil he essentially made up called New Guinea Man?
Oh, I actually don't recall that one. It must have been one of the little side notes on there. All I remember typically, I've got it probably buried in my notes somewhere, the actual tract. I've got physically one of the tracks. You can download them from their site. At least you could when he was alive. He died, I think, last. The main one that pops up is the one that gets noted by the creationist all the time, where there's a Peking man and the obligatory Nebraska man and all that kind of stuff. So New Guinea man, yeah. Let me do a little Google search on that one because now my curiosity is piqued, kid, and I'm kind of curious about what that one might be.
That here I found. Okay, here we go. So he does. I found a Talk Origins article for it. The list is like Lucy, Heidelberg man, Nebraska man, Piltdown man, Peking man, Neanderthal man, New Guinea man, Cro-Magnon man, and Modern man, which is so weird. I don't know why he has to keep.
Don't even know what New Guinea man. Yeah, fossil hominids, Big Daddy Talk Origins. I see it up in here.
Yeah, Arn Ross said he basically.
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah, Arn Ross said he basically made up New Guinea man, which is hilarious.
Or, well, what intrigues me is the prospect that he misunderstood something. That's what I'd be intrigued with. Yeah, I hadn't really paid close attention to it because it's been years and years since I had done the chapter on dates back to 1970. The species has been found in the region just north of Australia.
Oh yeah, I see
Wow.
the part where it
But
talks
I'll have
about
to
it.
keep that as a little side issue to try to figure out whether or not anything has ever been done as to where that might come from. Because some of these things are really diagnostic. There was the case, yikes, of Steve Austin. A creationist had tossed me a reference to a paper by, actually it wasn't a paper, it was just one of the little acts and facts kinds of things from Institute for Creation Research. But anyway, it was from this guy, Hush and Austin, on supposed problems with mollusks and catastrophic flooding that was causing deposits of stuff. And I hadn't had this in my bibliography before, so bingo, it cites technical literature. I'm going to plug it into the data set. And as I went down through that, I hit reference 20, which when I started looking up, it was an article in a pending book. And as I looked around Googling, now I think it was like 2004 the thing was, and so this was like 12 years, 13 years later. I couldn't find any reference to the article or the book anywhere in any context whatsoever. And that was always intriguing because typically creationists are fair and they actually steal stuff that actually exists. Well, the author of the article was an actual scientist. He's a geologist and paleontologist at, I think, University of Montana or somewhere. And I emailed him asking him about this. And he had no clue what this thing was. He had this supposed mollusk problem that Hush and them were talking about. He didn't know what the hell that referred to. And he gave me some context about what his work had been. And so what I realized was, and I would bet that it was Hush rather than Austin, because Austin is really sparse on footnoting and referencing, is that Hush gotten a reference to some conference that some creationist took notes on and wrote down some stuff, and then it got filtered through and sent down to them, and they treated it as if it were a real thing, and then failed to fact check to find out whether or not this supposed book or whatever had actually panned out and turned into something. So that was the telephone game. So that's, by the way, very rare. You can look far and wide, and it's extremely rare to find an example of an imaginary source. Information that is cockamamie misrepresented, and the stuff that Kent Hovind was fielding. I'm going to have to remember New Guinea Man now. If I ever live long enough to be able to do the updates for the Human Evolution chapter for TIP, I'll be wanting to keep a track on that, because it's just the kind of little minutia that in and of itself tells you something about their thought processes. It tells you how they're riffing off of secondary material and then leapfrogging ahead in order to make something that has the right image. And so this, when I told you scholarship is a contact sport, I mean it. Mm-hmm. That it's the nuts and bolts of how you build an argument. And if you rely on primary sources, it's not that you can't have your head up your ass, but it's really uncomfortable there if you have too many sources. It's a crowded space. So it's harder to pull off. But if you are relying entirely on secondary sources, and people who really do believe things that are, and make very bad decisions, are ones who rely too easily on secondary sources. And if the secondary sources can even be right, that are too heavily reliant on talk origins or posts from Wikipedia, or that there's a series of posts at the evolution thing at the University of California, Berkeley, that are just cute little summaries online of various evolution issues. And it's like macroevolution, and it's like a page of things, and they have some pictures and that. No sources. None. And I would find people who would be citing that, and it's clearly utilization of a secondary authority. But it's actually, from an information content point of view, absolutely useless, because there's no sources in it for you to be able to document the thing they're arguing. So in my respect, that's not helping your case any. And if you actually bump into somebody who is a Dwayne Gish style detail freak, they're going to tear you to shreds. Imagine if you had bumped into this guy live, know what you now know about Beardsley and Proto-Avis, and he starts waving this technical paper at you. As Beardsley pointed out in Nature in 1986, I can give you the reference, sir. Now you won't be snowed by it, because you know the data stream.
Yeah, it's
yeah.
I mean, also, I think part of the problem is when they can use when they try to use primary sources, trying to look for the word or phrase, to support their arguments, but the primary sources are difficult for me. Like if I'm looking at something like geology, for instance, and they're trying to support flood geology, which is just as
Yeah.
oxymoronic as Dr. Hovind, then uh, it's just sometimes I can't read the technical literature, but also you don't want to
Yeah.
take their word for it because you know what angle they're trying to play. You just
Yeah,
kind of
and
have
that's
to
where
suspend judgment
it's
on it.
tough. It's hard work, but in the end, it is extremely gratifying. The mode that I do is if I wade into a technical area, when I look at the technical literature and my eyes glaze over, I don't want to wade into that yet because it means I don't know the terminology and therefore I can't evaluate stuff. But it's not rocket science. That once you learn the terminology, once you can expand it and pull back the tricks to figure out what they're talking about, it's the same thing as in your biology field or any other area. It's exactly the same methodology. All rigorous thought involves the precise definition of terminology, the precise and reliable usage of primary sources. And at that point, if you're going to be analyzing something from a source methods base, in effect, I'm always cross-checking my technical sources because I follow up. So you've heard me mention the Koonin piece from nucleic acids research, the Holy Grail paper, the wow Christmas in July paper that was just one of the ones that was most impressive things I had read in years because it has such a dense compendium of information on multicellularity systems and their evolution that bunch of stuff I hadn't got. Well, in searching out those the primary source literature he's alluding to on all of these little fiddly bits with trinoflagellates and all the other stuff that I didn't already have in my bibliography, I am in effect vetting his reliability. That the paper does indeed discuss what he's talking about. He's not misrepresenting its material. It's not having some little piece of information that actually blows his argument to smithereens. So you're constantly improving the reason why I regard Koonin as somebody who is really impressive. And when I drop Koonin's name, other people go, oh yeah, there is somebody that you really want to pay attention to.
Yeah.
Now, you use that same principle when you're looking at a Snelling paper on flood geology. And it's tougher to do, but remember, he's making a series of assertions, and the assertions are grounded in technical literature. And you'll also want to notice something else, is when he makes an assertion that he doesn't put a source for. That can be just as meaningful when suddenly you've got the hop, skip, and a jump of a conclusion, but he's not putting the material in between. Michael Denton does exactly the same thing. And then the harder part is the error of omission. That you may find that the little technical data blips that the guy is presenting are true and accurate. But what if he's leaving things out? What if he's trying to frame the argument to put it in a particular perspective so that if you look at it this way, it looks one way. But if you put the perspective back in, you realize that it's an illusion.
That's
and
like
so there, I gradually, jump in.
Oh, I was gonna say, yeah, that's what they do with Alan Fiducia.
Yeah. Yeah, the Fred Hoyle of bird evolution, as I call him. I mean, it's a nasty thing to say, but it's a peculiar thing. And of course, he may punch me in the nose if he ever actually bumps into me physically. He's an ornithologist by trade. Yeah, not as a bar. Yeah, that's it. Yes, noted ornithologist Dex. Annoying critic of creationism, but Fiducia, in my mind, was being awfully evasive when he would, as a technical consultant to Jonathan Wells for Icons of Evolution. And I'm going, excuse me, is this the kind of people you really want to be associated with here? You know, and there's a lot of people's reputations can get kind of soiled about the ones that you bump into. It pops up with McHenry, I think his name is. He's a lower echelon paleontologist guy that has dealt with some Ediacara biota. And I think I mispronounced his name. It's just something or other, but it starts with an MC. And his most recent material pops up in a weird little air quotes science journal that's run by the Lyndon LaRouche gang that are in the Wackaloon super right wing, the Queen of England is the head of the drug cartel bunch.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I know. You're going, whoa, wait a minute. And so you got some really weird
I can see it
connections
now.
of ones where has not been able to get published in major journals much anymore. And so he finds one that's kind of congenial enough, but doesn't look too closely at the provenance of what it's dealing with. You always have to worry about that. When when the journal that's being dealt with is relatively trivial, where they have a big gap in their publication history. And that's why you want to look to see who uses the work. Anybody can publish anything. But when a paper pops up in PNAS, which is why this is nice being on PNAS, Science used to do this in the ancient days, but they revamped their website. Find this information if you're a subscriber, but I don't have money for that. So, but in the old days,
yeah, I'm not doing it.
When you look,
not for the money they charge.
Abstract, oh, great. Well, yeah, because you go through college. When you look up the abstract in the old days in Science, it would tell you the paper in the network, papers that cited it since. And the same thing over in PNAS. Yeah. They do that still.
They do on Google Scholar too, I think.
Well, yeah, there's various things, you can track around in other little areas, but the convenience of the thing, PNAS, there's an advantage to coming back to a subject cold, because when I'm looking through my older material as I'm plugging them into the tip system, I might be looking at a paper from 2005 that I had the abstract of, and oh, it's PNAS. Well, I take my little thing out and I look it up now and see what's happened to the paper since. And if it's a dull thud, there's just nobody making use of it, that's one thing. If I've got 4 pages of references that have used it since, that's a paper that's got legs. And so you can get caught up on a field just by following up that scholarly trail thing in a way that gives you a heuristic of the valuableness of the paper. And of course, you can often find situations. One thing I do now constantly in TIP is, it's true for Science, Nature, and PNAS, that when they have a comments, criticism stuff, in fact, those are always free. Critical comment on a paper and the response of the authors, those are free as PDFs all the time. And so I immediately plug those in. That means you're putting a question mark next to the work, that yes, the work is interesting, but there's been a bit of a squabble about it. So you better take a look and see what camps are involved to find out what the background is.
Yeah, what I think is really interesting about, one of the really objective things about, I'm going to say it, Wikipedia, is that they cite all of their sources. They will link you to all the primary sources for their material, and they'll say,
which is another flag.
Yeah, they'll say, this paper has caused some controversy. Here are 2 other papers, primary sources that criticize it, which I think is great.
Yeah,
that's
Wikipedia is a great springboard. Wikipedia is a useful resource. It is not the destination, and anybody who thinks of it as a destination needs to have their butt cleaned out because their head is up it too tightly. But the material itself can often be very useful. In some cases, it can be negatively useful. Sometimes there'll be some taxa that pops up, and I'll do a Google search on it, and up comes the Wikipedia page, and I click on the Wikipedia page, and it just has the vaguest of descriptions, and there's not a single source in it. That's an immediate flag that, wow, there's not a hell of a lot of work on this thing, is there? Or I'm going to have to dig really deep to find it. I find it even in the secondary issues, in working on Phileas Fogg, because I do historical research on the various places that I put my characters. And sometimes I'll find stuff where there'll be a Wikipedia page on a thing, and no, it's not actually giving me any information at all. So I have to go back to the drawing board.
Well,
but yeah, Wikipedia.
Yeah, if it's something new, if it's a new area of research or what have you, or a new fossil, they want to be cautious so that they don't, make any assertions that are unsubstantiated, which I think is very admirable. I think that's very admirable for a source that's, summarizing technical data.
It's a useful heuristic tool. Wikipedia is giving you kind of a thumbnail introduction to a subject matter.
Yeah.
Now, if you want to have another useful thing, that's why something like Conservapedia or Creation Wiki is in their own way just as methodologically revealing, because it's telling you what they pay attention to and what they don't. This is one of the most important lessons of the scholar, is recognize the hierarchy of volume and the hierarchy of data. The least interesting person in an anti-evolution exchange is somebody who signed their name to the Discovery Institute Descent from Darwin list, and that's all you can find out about them. Whoa, that's helpful. because you don't know why they're a skeptic of Darwin. Is it because they were raised in an evangelical family? Is it because they had an epiphany when they were 25? Is it because they're the world's greatest something or other in the sciences and all of their evidence points to this direction? Who? What? On what basis? Or did they read Jonathan Wells's Icons of Evolution and have an epiphany? We don't know. If they actually step off the belt and do a posting somewhere and tell us what they think, now we're starting to get somewhere. But if they are the Holy Grail and they write article after article, book after book, posting after posting, and you have a track record like Casey Luskin that runs on for a decade or more, where there's hundreds and hundreds of postings. Now, from a scholarly methods point of view, do you realize what we have there? Map of what interests him, and we have a map of what doesn't. But if in all of those postings, certain subjects never arise, now you have a measurement of it in a way you wouldn't from just the signal signature. Because how curious can they be about therapsids, and yet it never arises in all of those postings, that they never bumped into it. When I bumped into Luskin then in 2013, when he had his little free shtick over on the coast at a church, and he's an amiable little guy. And amazingly enough, he remembered me because I had an email exchange with him some years before. We had never actually met otherwise, and he remembered my name, and or he was bullshitting, I don't know. But anyway, I'm inclined to think he actually remembered me. And I handed him the material from tip 1.3 on punctuated equilibrium because basically I skewer him in it, and I wanted him to have a heads up on it. And I was asking him about the reptile-mammal transition because I had a whole bunch of stuff on why the reptile-mammal transition was being misrepresented by all the intelligent designers. And I had both of the Discovery Institute's 2 books on the subject there. And he told me, which I suspect was entirely true, oh, I've never actually looked into that.
Mm-hmm.
And but I'd be happy to see your information. Send that to me, he said with a sweet smile. And I sent him 3 macroevolutionary episodes PDF and some allusions to some of the technical information. So this was about 2013 or so.
Probably deleted his own email address.
Well, the point is, he never replied back, no commentaries or whatever on it. Now, later on, I discovered in writing 3 Evolution Slam Dunk that when Design of Life came out, he actually had written a short squib for the Discovery Institute where he was appraising it for its wonderful science, and especially the section on the reptile-mammal transition. Although he apparently had never studied the subject, he was perfectly willing to recommend somebody else who hadn't studied the subject, and he was perfectly pleasing on that. Well, now we move beyond, and I, having written Slam Dunk, I now have the entire field of the reptile-mammal transition under my belt, and can be much, I would have a completely different way of approaching Luskin on this matter now, if I were to bump into him, which I haven't had the honor to do yet. Evil grin.
Sits outside his house with the binoculars. He's got
yeah, I don't even know where I think he was over in Seattle. And when the show, well, near a couple hundred miles. In fact, all the Discovery Institute gang are over on the coast. I think Michael Medved is a Seattle guy, and I think Axon Gager and all the rest are over there. And so there's a whole cluster all hovering around the little office block that's the Discovery Institute. I'm sure has very nicely decorated carrels and looks very, very upbeat and all of that. And meanwhile, I operate from my pathetic little den with the CDs, operating on a shoestring budget where I can't even afford a damn microphone and a headphone. But nonetheless, I do with what I have as best I can. And I'm willing to stack up my output on my limited income than what they manage to do with their big budgets.
Yeah. Interesting. What?
So the fun part will be.
Oh wait, BJ is asking you a question. He says, "Who are people you would have a debate with?"
Oh wow. Ideally, up around as high echelon as possible. Several people have said, "Would you debate Kent Hovind?" I'm going, "Yeah." I'd love to go on the fossil record. Frankly,
you know, I know
that.
I've been apprised a bit on some of the recent stuff Hovind's been doing. I saw his utter destruction at the hands of King Crocoduck and Bill Ludlow. Those were great.
Ludlow was really well on his game, although even there and Crocoduck, both from a methods point of view, were leaving doors open. At every opportunity, I would want to be reminding people of Kent Hovind's non-existent secondary source base, that he makes bald assertions and claims about stuff. And if you know the scholarly frame that he's operating from, you can start undermining that source. Remember, Hovind, although he may burble on at one point, I've got a list of things in this latest debate where they talk about life coming from rocks. And I'm going, I don't care how many authority quotes you have on that. I read the damn technical literature. If you've got stuff that you've scavenged from some stuff from 20 years ago off of a quote mine, I know what the actual technical literature is. Would you like to discuss that, Kent? Have you read any of it? Those are source methods questions. And I'm happy to deal with that on that. Origins or bust, origin of life would be the toughest one to handle because it's an unresolved question. And that's the one that would be Steve Meyer would be someone I would want to go in on. But I would want to tackle people certainly on the reptile-mammal transition because I would have the high ground of knowing everything on it, all sides of the debate. And so I can pick and choose where to drop my anvils in a way that they wouldn't otherwise. You, Ross, invite me on his little radio program, I think in October, his little podcast that he does. And I said, sure. I've never refused an opportunity to debate or discuss something. The problem is that they don't tend to turn out to work out for themselves. There was a guy who was doing a lecture over here and his associate said, oh boy, would you like to debate Casey Luskin? And I go, sure, arrange it. Would you like to verse Steve Meyer? Yeah, sure, arrange it. But he and then nothing happens. I don't know whether it's the case that some people have actually heard of me, not entirely thrilled at the prospect of jousting with me. I don't know. I would think Hovind is afraid of anybody. And so I would think he would be perfectly happy onto that. And we'll see whether or not he's that way after that. The Holy Grail. Yeah, jump in.
Oh, I'd say I would definitely take on Purdom. She is someone I'd like to go after because it just showing that she is totally ignorant on the genetics, in general, I think would be something important to point out.
Well, she actually has a tiny publication trail in real science.
I've seen that she did like research with mice and stuff like that. But I just think that it would be important to show that even though she's an actual PhD geneticist, she doesn't really understand a whole lot about genetics. At least from watching AIG.
From a methods point of view, I would pick, first of all, you'd want to isolate what are probably her best case arguments, her best case papers. And she's got enough of a paper trail that there's a lot to choose from. And then you pick up, a matter of fact, let me just look and see how many how much Purdom I've got in my data set here. See, this is the advantage of having a universal source. I can see the entire landscape in one fell swoop, which I couldn't if I were just dealing with stuff. Okay, let's see. She's got Leitner stuff in 2011 on determining the art kind. So biogeography is too. And, oh, whoops. Not responding. Okay, it's having a conniption fit. It's the difficulty of me trying to run a data stream on that. Anyway, the argument that I would always be using with somebody is you want to know what their best case is, their best argument, their most solid claim, and be able to pick at those. And then the other issue is, especially in a debate context, I love the idea of the opponent picking the topic. Why? Is because unless they're an idiot, they're going to want to pick their best case. So they're going to want to pick the one they're most familiar with. They feel they've got their slam dunk, and you probably got the best chance that you'll have a full range. There we go. The word processor came back on again. Georgia Purdom, holy moly. I've got, see, starting in 2006 on evolution of finch beaks, all the way down, blah, blah, blah. 2013, did life come from outer space? And then a thing she did in 2011, exposing the anointed, and a thing she did in that's a different Purdom. Okay, we're on to that. So I've got certainly over a dozen materials. She's got studying how our cave man different, race issues, irreducible complexity, variety within created kinds, gene duplication, evolution shooting itself. And this sounds like one that would be a kicker to go at in 2008. And so what you would do would pick a sampling. She self-identifies as sampling if you communicate with her in advance to get a sense of what turf she wants to defend on. Then you look up that material, get a complete her primary source base, and then can analyze how you can then deploy the information you know from under on everything. That's the appropriate way to deal with the debate. Know your opponent, know the turf, be able to improvise quickly. If they've got a track record of apologetics, and she does, you know how they present stuff. She does stuff on video. I haven't actually looked at a lot of her video material, other than the one that we did with Apologia, because I don't bother too much with the video context. But it means that you have enough time to prepare to watch quite a few of those to get a sense of her live style if you're doing with a live debate. All of that is all part of the preparation thing. It always, and it's partly improv theater.
Yeah, it seems a lot of the evolutionary stuff she goes after is almost entirely secondary sources. Watching their show, they'll read an article and they'll say, "Oh, from the Huffington Post or National Geographic." It's like, why don't you guys ever go to the papers themselves and read the technical, just the abstract? Just read the abstract of the article.
That was the point that I made with Paul, was that every single one of their claims in the piece that we went after were secondary sources, sometimes tertiary sources. One of which was from Sputnik, the Russian propaganda arm of Putin. I mean, this is just a pathetic set of trails that they were dealing with. Ironically, behind all of these things, in almost every case, was a real paper that was really interesting, and I often didn't have in my bibliography, and now added to my bibliography. So now I learn more about the technical literature, and inadvertently, then you strengthen your own case. The addiction to secondary sources, feel free to quote the RJ, #tip dataset, 95% of anti-evolutionists covered, over 8,000 sources, 2,000 people. 95% of them don't cite primary sources at all. They will be secondary redactors who copy other people. Purdom is being par for the course. The idea that you would actually look at the original material and understand it first before shooting your mouth off on it. No, instead they're trawling through the news to find news of the day, and they're going to find a way to snark at it and pigeonhole it as a diffuse method, and then they never think about it again. That's another thing you'll find if you look at, it's like reading, nothing is more hilarious than reading a prophecy book from a long time ago. Like the predictions from the psychics from 1975. And you remember President Edward Kennedy and all of the things that happened, and the nuclear war we had with the Soviet Union. There's a whole bunch of things that somehow we managed to skip that now seem hilarious when you look at it far back. You'll find the creationists, when they will do these little squibs, will tend not to think about, and once they get the little blip, it acts like an apologetic iceberg, and it starts floating farther and farther back. So that's when they'll bring out the Beardsley paper from 1986. That wasn't a paper, it was a commentary piece about something that was completely defunct, and it literally would never have occurred to them to find out what had happened in the 30 years since.
No, because they're just not, you're right, they're not interested in it. They don't care. If it supports their argument, then that's great for 10 minutes, but then after that, who cares?
Yeah. And so it's one of the reasons why, just as a practical matter, creationism, in the vague sense of non-evolutionism, dropped the ball in 1859, and it's been fumbles ever since. That they've contributed nothing to anything. They've been sideliners. They have their little apologetics ups and downs, but they have political impact. Because particularly since the Coulter-Camp 1980s, and when the Coulter-Camp basically took over the Republican Party in the late 1980s, then you now have a situation where there is an approved political ideology that maps in with the ideology of this culture camp religious bloc. And even if a lot of them don't go out of their way to mention anti-evolutionism, it's still lurking in the background. Even Al Gore in 2000 got into a little bit of hot water when he was saying kind of semi-nice things about intelligent design briefly, because he didn't want to antagonize some of his Tennessee constituents. And it's very easy. I, however, am an annoying prick and will say exactly what I think, and the devil will take the hindmost.
Well, I honestly don't hear. I know that, Louisiana is no bueno when it comes to intelligent design and creationism and, teach the controversy and all that. But honestly, I really don't hear much of anything about it in the news in our politics here. It's like we're just not talking about it. We're not talking about it until it becomes a problem, and then everyone's talking about it again.
Yeah, this is the wait till the barn door is open and the horses have run away modality. But it's not just about creationism. It's about science methods generally. There was a case that popped up during the campaign where one of the little jerks, and it was a guy from New Jersey. He's a politician there, and he was complaining about climate change and these damn liberals. Well, yeah, it wasn't him, but was one of his, I think he was from the state legislature. And he was complaining about this climate change junk. And Chris Cuomo was interviewing him, and I saw the coverage on it. And from a methods point of view, I'm screaming at the television set about this is not how you conduct an interview, Chris. Because Chris, the guy said that there's been a big controversy on the sciences about climate change. A lot of scientists say that it's not real. A methods question is immediately, who are these scientists that are complaining about it? That's when you would have discovered that this guy probably hasn't a clue who these scientists are. He's never read any of these material, and that question would have revealed it, and you would have gone into the deer in the headlight moment. But that's not what Chris Cuomo did. He instead said, oh, how do you explain the big consensus of scientists? Which is not an illegitimate question, but it's missing the point because you should have put a groundwork on his own
assertion
sources.
Against another assertion, essentially.
Yeah.
And what was interesting, it's still just a statement to a statement.
Yeah. But then what was funny was the New Jersey's guy's response, because he said, consensus. It was once the consensus among scientists that the earth was flat. At that point, poor Chris Cuomo was kind of in steam coming out of his ears, perplexed. The irony was, if he had known his material well enough, I would have immediately countered back, what makes you think it was the scientific consensus that the earth was flat? In fact, Greek science had worked out that it was a sphere 2,500 years ago. There really wasn't a scientific community at all. No learned person, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, thought the earth was flat. Even Columbus, the critics didn't think the earth was flat. They debated about how big it was, because what Columbus had when he was doing his little press agent deal, trying to goad the Ferdinand and Isabella to hawk the jewels to pay for his stupid cockamamie trip to India, was that he had gotten Toscanelli's globe, where Toscanelli had drawn on some cartographers who figured the earth was way smaller than the Greeks thought, and so it's only 3,000 miles across the Atlantic to India. Hey, let's back my startup, okay? And finally, he talked him into doing it. And by the greatest coincidence in history, it turned out there was a big landmass there about 3,000 miles away, which he immediately decided was India, populated by Indians, and away we go. But nobody thought the thing was flat. The other issue is it becomes just a popularity context of consensus. It doesn't matter what the consensus thinks, it's what the data are. And I would have contended that had Cuomo known enough to do methods questions, he could have easily demonstrated that this guy is a secondary source addict who has never read a paper on climate science in his life, has relied on secondary sources who have never read a paper in their life, and they are 900 miles away from the data set. And that would have come out if he had asked proper reportorial questions. Every reporter should know these fundamental methods approaches to not merely science issues, but political issues and others. It pops up in everything. If we're going to talk about whether or not 3 strikes you're out is a bad idea and it needs to be repealed, you need to look at empirical evidence about incarceration rates and recidivism and a whole pile up of things that are empirical issues. We're talking about that same matter of what data do you pay attention to, What information would cause you to change your mind? Do you work through what you think happened properly? I call it the map of time problem for creationism, but it has its counterparts in all technical issues. And so the toolkit that you would use in snarking at ageronism is indistinguishable from the toolkit you would use talking about climate change or drug policy in relation to marijuana and or drug policy in relation to big pharma and the healthcare reform issues. It's one universal toolkit. And I want to see more people
Big pharma.
play in a methods game. It shouldn't be a political issue. You'll notice PZ Myers and I are not on things about the Reagan tax policy and a lot of these economic issues. I think he's way more leftist than I am, from a family of leftists. I come from a family, my mom, one Democrat in her entire life, FDR in 32, and regretted it and never did again. She was as Republican as all get out. But she was also non-religious. And so our family, we had no religion element at all. So she was kind of atypical. She was a widowed woman who had to do all of her stuff on her own. She had a credit rating. She could have bought the Eiffel Tower on her credit card. She was just amazing at how he manages. And I did not inherit her skill at finances, I guarantee it.
Yeah, my family is conservative just through and through, just up one side and up the other. Total conservatism. But we're also very religious on one side. We're very religious on one side, and that is I mean, I think both sides are equally conservative, but one side is just uber religious. So
I come from a fairly conservative background and structure, and even as it is, I would consider myself kind of a moderate on economics. I probably would be closer to somebody like an Andrew Sullivan in terms of a lot of the issues. If you're familiar with him, the gay Roman Catholic, who is relatively middle of the road on financial issues. I think by and large, balance, budgets, and sound fiscal policy is like a good thing. You want to have an economic policy that doesn't produce inflation. You want an economic policy that will produce a broad distribution of wealth. You want good social mobility. There's a whole bunch of stuff, and a lot of understandable old line, old brand republicanism of the stuff that was popular before the modern culture camp version are issues that are perfectly relevant. One of the things that I liked about to see with the Clinton years, and one of the reasons why I tended to vote for Democrats after that, was because the Democrats had been in the complete thrall of their wacky left wing for years, and they couldn't win an election to save their soul. And suddenly the new breed of these more conservative Democratic governors got together and figured out, that you don't have to be browbeating business all the time. But even as it is, he went ahead and they raised tax rates on rich people, which was a good policy to do. Some of the things that they did, the luxury tax thing sounded good. If you this may be green eye shade before you were born stuff. I don't know. Not shake your head if you're going, what the hell are you talking about? In the early 90s, ironically, here's a history lesson to give some context for stuff. Bill Clinton comes in as the new president, and they were faced with really big deficits, because one of the problems with the Reaganomics was that because they were so busy on destroying the Soviet Union, we have monstrous defense budgets, and to get the big defense budgets, you basically couldn't program. So we had a lot of stuff coming in, plus the tax cuts meant that there was less revenue coming in at a certain point. So we ended up with increasingly large deficits, which magnified all the way through Bush's term until there was a mild recession came in, and then Clinton becomes the new president. Well, the Democrats still controlled the House. Think of the guy's name, who was one of the big deficit hawks in the Congress, and he was kind of an idiot on a lot of respects. But what he did was basically talk Dick Gebhardt, and he eventually talked, rightly so, Clinton into a big grand bargain where they'd actually decided to deal with the deficit. So they worked out a thing where we ended up with shock. We had budget surpluses during the Clinton years. I know you may have never heard of such a thing, but the government was taking in more money out in stuff. So it was actually able to whittle down the national debt a little bit during the Clinton years. And that, of course, got a big break. The moment Bush came in, the second Bush, and they put in their giant tax cut, which we're still living under. And suddenly those deficits disappeared, And now you ended up with, the deficit reduction disappeared, and you ended up with deficits again. And they stayed at pretty much a modest but still sustaining level all the way through the Bush terms and into the Obama years, by which, of course, we were now trying to dig ourselves out of the 2008 collapse. And so we had a huge increase, but not spectacularly huge. It roughly doubled the debt up to about 1 year's GDP. If you're familiar with, we got about 20, somewhere around 24 trillion national debt, somewhere in that ballpark. And that's roughly 1 year's GDP. To put this into perspective, gross domestic product, that's the situation we were in after World War II, when we had all that World War II debt. Remember, World War II was financed by war bonds. Basically, you borrowed the money. And so everybody was clipping coupons. Nobody could buy anything. So you didn't have to worry about buying anything. You just bought war bonds. And so you had, even as it is, they had to constantly issue new war bonds. Because the idea that everybody was in favor of World War II and everybody was all pulling together patriotically is not quite as clear cut. And when you actually look at the actual demographics and the history of these kind of things, that's why they had to have repeated war bond drives and all of that. And we came out of the war with the only economy on earth that was humming, and it was in full production. And now it had the gear shift in a hurry. So we started building cars and all this stuff again. And then they started building masses of houses that were restricted so black people couldn't buy them, and all sorts of wonderful things that were coming out. And we ended up with a big post-war up and down boom thing. And a pretty sustained economic growth all the way into Eisenhower, when in '58 there was a bit of a recession. The car industry, that's when the big fins on Cadillacs and all of that, the car sales don't. Anyway, there's a big long history lesson on stuff. And too many people, here's the old fart on history lesson front. I had a really humiliating experience on the last discussion I was having online, because I happened to make a reference about, it was about the morality. It was in the after show following the Kent Hovind debate on morality. And I was using what I thought was an appropriate quote from The African Queen, which was the old 1950 movie with Katharine Hepburn and anyway, that she had this marvelous line about nature, Mr. Allnut, is what we are put on earth to rise above. That this was the issue about what the is versus ought and all that. And the one young kid in there says, nobody's seen that movie. We don't know anything about what it is. And it was quite correct to point that out. And I realized, what an old fart I am to talk about a film from the 1950s. And I pointed out, well, you should actually take a look at that movie, because
I have to say,
there's an awful lot of great.
The Rear Window is one of my favorite movies.
Oh, that's the quintessential Hitchcock movie. If you need to see one Hitchcock film, it's just Crystal. First of all, it's got Grace Kelly in it. Holy moly. I mean, Grace Kelly is could light up a room. She's drop dead gorgeous. And I'm gay. So, I mean, let me give you a sense about how drop dead gorgeous she is. Plus, you've got Jimmy Stewart.
Oh, he's great.
At the absolute peak of his form. And remember, too, the little masseuse woman, Thelma Ritter. Wow, what a wonderful performance she delivers.
The Man Who Knew Too Much. That's another one.
Yeah, that's the only Hitchcock movie Hitchcock himself remade. The Man Who Knew Too Much had been done originally. It was his first big hit, in fact, his first big thriller in 1934, I think. And it kind of made him a new star, because he'd been making sound movies for about 3 or 4 years. And quite a few Hitchcock films have been remade over the years, but Man Who Knew Too Much is the only one Hitchcock himself remade. And it's revealing to show how he did it. And it's also interesting to see that it's a litmus test as to Hitchcock fans, because Hitchcock fans will split into two camps. The ones that like the early version is the best one versus the ones that like the remake. Hitchcock preferred the remake. And he didn't just refilm it. He reformatted the whole plot. He changed the dynamics of it. He altered the ending, removed huge blocks of the storyline. But the one thing that kicks in, that's the same in both versions, and since you've seen the movie, I hope you'll be nodding your head and going, yeah, I remember that, is the famous sequence where the critical bit of a Hitchcock suspense scene is the audience knows something nobody else does. So the audience knows that There's this choral section where the chorus goes da
Yes.
da 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 bang, and they're going to
Yeah.
hit the cymbals, and the assassin is going to take the gun, and at the moment the cymbals strike, is going to fire, and they will be able to assassinate the person. And in all the hysteria and the noise, they'll be run away, and they'll get away with it perfectly. Blah blah blah. Now,
Right.
they have found out about this plot, this couple, and the villains have kidnapped their child and are holding them to keep them from telling this. And the wife is there in the theater. She knows when it's going to happen because she heard the music. They were practicing on the record player. And she is just standing there, and you see the music playing. Bernard Herrmann, by the way, is conducting in the remake version. And it's just racing along. And in the remake, it's Doris Day. And you could just see her just, and she
I guess
can't
she's
see
crying.
anything.
Yeah.
And the gun is starting to point out of the thing, and it's moving out of behind the curtain, and the shadows falling apart, and he's just milking it for everything it's the word. If you look at the two versions, the 34 version and the 56 version, you really got to be a hard ass if you don't say Hitchcock's version in the 56 one is much more suspenseful. It builds to its panic crescendo. He's got stereophonic sound. He's got the color photography. He's got everything, the angles and everything. He's a master of his craft at that point. And then, of course, the spoiler alert, just before the cymbal strikes, she screams in that wonderful way that only Doris Day, who has the lungs of a could do masterfully. She was actually quite and still alive, I think. She a big animal rights advocate. She lives over in Seattle on an island somewhere, as I recall. And she was actually quite a powerful dramatic actress. And here is always more than you think it is. Think about the character relationships. If you look at if you've never seen the original version of the movie, I imagine.
No, I'm not.
It had Peter Lorre in it. Peter Lorre was the villain. One of the couple movies he did for Hitchcock. But anyway, the plot's remarkably different, and it's a lighter tone. The more bantering couple, Edward Banks, Lionel Banks, I think his name was, who was a wonderful character actor in Britain, a relatively comedic actress wife. But look at the difference between that and the version with Jimmy Stewart. Jimmy Stewart is on vacation with his singer wife, who has apparently had a nervous breakdown, and he's prescribing drugs to her all the time to keep her from having panic attacks. This is a complicated relationship for a light movie. They actually are a very tense and nervous, troubling couple who, in the course of this suspense thing, overcome their circumstances and become a well-balanced couple as a result of it. So it's just way more is going on in the remake version, in the first version. So I can see why, from my point of view, the remake is a more a subtle and ingenious film, and it's at the top of his realm. But the Rear Window is quintessential because it puts up the whole essence of what Hitchcock is. Hitchcock is the ultimate manipulator. He loved the fact that he was a manipulator. Do you realize what you are when you go to a movie? You're a voyeur. That pays money to have a fat little bisexual Englishman tell you what you're supposed to feel, manipulate you frame by frame, moment by moment, cause you to have scares and laugh at just the right moments. He controls your life. Now, what's the subject of the story? It's about a voyeur watching things happen across the street. So you are the voyeur that goes to the voyeur master's show about the voyeur finding a murder across the way. It's the ultimate storyline. The set is a masterpiece of construction. And the way he points out, there are all these little vignettes that go on with the characters down below. The poor little Miss Lonely Hearts. Your heart is weeping for this woman down there that is trying to find a date and never quite managing it. It's just a side bit in the story that has almost no dialogue. You're just seeing it through his binoculars, and yet you're just so sad for this poor woman. The young couple that you don't know how well they're going to turn out. They've got sex up the yin-yang, but they're probably going to have a trouble staying together because that's probably all that's holding them together. The musician writer that gets together with the thing. The poor little woman whose dog is killed and all that. It's just, there's all these little vignettes that are happening that all play in the story and how he controls your mind. And he would even use famous example. Oh, jump right in if you need to say something. Somebody's talking on the.
No, they're just they're just kind of talking about Alfred Hitchcock right now in the chat.
Points out
I
with the
was just
advances in cinema, you lose almost nothing of the other experiences except the experience of the collective reaction. That's a good point. That that there is an element of, if you watch Star Wars on your home set, you won't get the reaction you would have got in the theater, where when the starship goes into light speed and escapes the villains, everybody is just roaring. Ah! You don't get that on the home video. But in terms of picture quality, Blu-ray.
first shot first.
Yeah, sorry. Slight malfunction here.
There was
Anyway,
yeah, I think
the Blu-ray of a lot of these films will be picture quality that you would never have seen in the typical theater performance. And you can see, especially if you have a pretty good large size screen, things that were filmed in VistaVision. A film, if you look at a Rear Window on Blu-ray, holy moly!
I saw it at the
You would have to be
Robinson.
hard pressed to find a theater. It's just incredibly clear picture. There's the cinematography details. He's very careful about stuff. But anyway, Hitchcock would offer as one of his classic examples of the nature of film a scene from Rear Window. He says you have a scene where Jimmy Stewart is looking through his binoculars. And then the next scene, you'll see him smiling. What happens in between tells you what you think about that smile. There's nothing intrinsic to the smile as to what you feel about it. He says if he puts a scene in where he puts the binoculars up and then cuts to a little girl playing with a ball, the smile will have one reaction. If you intercut a scene where a girl is doing a striptease across the way, well, now has a completely different context and you react to it completely different. He decides what the smile means, not Jimmy Stewart. Essence of Hitchcock. There was no person on earth who constructed the film frame by frame by frame by frame by frame before he ever filmed it. And so with very few exceptions, the last thing he actually bothered about and the thing he hated most was filming the movie, because it was already done in the preparation work. And all he had to do was to move the actors like cattle, as the simile goes, in front of the camera to get them to do what he needed to do so he could put together the film that he'd already run in his head. You want to see that? Rear Window is the perfect one.
Yeah, it's a great movie. It's absolutely wonderful. One of my favorites.
Franz Waxman's music, too. I don't know if the name rings a bell or not. I would be gobsmacked if it did.
Nope.
Nope. Franz Waxman was one of the, he did work initially as working in the orchestra in Broadway shows in the 1920s and 30s. And like a lot of people, when sound came in, laugh all out. RJ explaining Hitchcock is an experience, Fino says. I hope so. I hope I'm not boring everybody. But now we're going on to film music and Franz Waxman. Waxman came to Hollywood like a lot of other people. And one of his first really big things was when they realized that in the sound era, idea to have music, and it was not immediately obvious you should do that, because initially they were thinking, well, won't people wonder where the orchestra is? Because there were live act orchestras when they did silent movies, and all silent movies were wall-to-wall music, and then that ended suddenly when you went into sound. And unless you did a musical where you had source music, dramas had no music at all. And it now seems uncomfortable to us. Well, Max Steiner, who was working at RKO at the time, later went over to Warner Brothers, did little movies like Gone with the Wind later on. He was trying to talk David O. Selznick, who also went over to MGM eventually, that you should use music. And he did that for one film, The Most Dangerous Game, and then a little film you may have heard of, King Kong.
I've seen Most Dangerous Game also.
Yeah, that was the very first Hollywood film that had a fully composed film score. And people suddenly went, boy, that's okay. I guess we can have music. And so everybody started imitating. Well, one of the first...
Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, go jump in. You have to tell me to shut up once in a while.
Oh, I was just gonna say they made us read the story also. And so I really liked it. I thought we read the book first and then saw the movie. So
It's a classic book. It's been remade quite a few times. In fact, I think they just redid a version of it. It's been made like 4 or 5 times. It's a classic thing because it's about some. You can't even imagine the idea of a rich person that's so privileged that he thinks he can hunt people.
Well,
I know we can't imagine anything like that in the real world, but that's the premise of this. I think it was a 19th century novel, but I could be wrong on that one.
Well, now now if you're a rich person and you can manage enough funds to get elected, you can put millions of people in jeopardy by taking away their.
They have a new
contest.
We have a new breed of most dangerous game where we got lots of people with little teeny guns. But anyway, Tangerine Dream versus Vangelis discussed. That's a whole fun subject of soundtracks. I'll have to go back to that. Yeah, that's fun. The electronic film score.
I am just totally clueless here in these conversations. I just got to say.
A lot of it is because a lot of it's before you were born. When I'm thinking Tangerine Dream and Vangelis, we're talking movies in the 1980s, and that's way beyond your experience, Frank. When we're talking Franz Waxman, we're now back in the 30s and 40s and 50s. Some of the most spectacular film scores ever were done by Franz Waxman. The first one that really hit was The Bride of Frankenstein, which was the first one. The Frankenstein had no music in it for all practical purposes. But Bride of Frankenstein, they were now doing the music-y thing. And if you've ever seen any of the old Flash Gordon serials, the old black and white ones, you'll hear a bunch of music that was cribbed from Franz Waxman's Bride of Frankenstein score. Da, 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 da. And it's really, really fascinating stuff because they used it over and over again over there at Universal. If you've ever had a chance to see the Philadelphia Story with Jimmy Stewart and Katharine Hepburn.
Nope.
That's 1939. That is an amazing story. It's a hilarious script. It was done. You are familiar with Katharine Hepburn?
Yes.
At all? Okay. Katharine Hepburn is an amazing person because she's had more the ups and downs of any actress in history. Just think of Meryl Streep on steroids. And because she won 4 Oscars in her huge film career, but she had ups and downs, unlike Meryl Streep, who's basically had a long run of continuous success. But when Katharine Hepburn got her first Oscar in, I think, 30 or 32. Oh, Kevin Smith joined the video call. Hello, Kevin.
Hello.
You're just an icon with a blocked out thing.
I have to say, someone mentioned Flash Gordon in the side.
Oh yes, Queen. Yes. I have rhapsodized about Flash Gordon. It was a movie I did not expect to like, and I thought it was going to be just a silly, and it was a silly film, but it was just basically an attempt to rip off the success of Star Wars, which it was. But to my surprise,
it was ridiculous.
It won me over. It's a charming, silly movie, but it's actually got a lot of subtlety and depth to it. The screenwriter, Lorenzo Semple Jr., has a very clever script, an amazingly adroit score by Queen. And I'm not by nature a rock music fan, but it served the movie extremely well. It produced the right moods and that. There's only a couple areas where I might have quibbled a little bit about kind of the overly rockish attack from the Hawkman at the end of the movie and that, but most of it was really well done. The orchestrator that worked with it was very clever. So it's a movie that I recommend. Plus, if you get to see it, get Blu-ray if you can, because it's filmed in Todd AO and is just gobsmackingly beautiful. It's got Topol, who's a wonderful performer, can do very good comedic shtick, and Max von Sydow is just scenery chewing hilarious as Ming the Merciless. It's a film you will either love it or hate it. Middle ground about Flash Gordon, but I'd say that if you have a love for just, if you are willing to accept that it's just a light, silly little story that's got heart, works extremely well.
I actually saw it because it's really funny. It's really funny. Getting a start to dry. Because I was babysitting these 2 little kids, and they liked the movie, and so they played it one day when I came over to babysit them, because I babysit them for like 2 weeks, like it's like each day or each like weekday for about 2 weeks or so, something like that.
Oh,
But
that little
yes,
guilty pleasure. Yeah, kids can often get really entranced by the story. It's very pop art, colorful, and all that. It's
but
really
yeah,
fun.
so they liked it because they wanted to watch it. I watched it and I thought, huh, interesting.
One of my favorite lines in, well, actually, there's several of the favorite lines. The one where Dale Arden is drinking the stuff that's the various Seraglio have to keep themselves sort of drugged for being the merciless, and she's sipping this stuff and says, "Boy, that's good. Yeah, she can hold her liquor in a way that these Mongolite women can't." And then the other one was when Zarkov and Timothy Dalton's character, the Prince, whatever his name was, they're strung up in this dungeon, and you cut to the scene where he's saying, "Tell me more about this Houdini." I love that line. Plus, for something where the show shows that it's way more serious than you might give it credit for, it's the scene where the brain drain of Professor Zarkov. And it's this, essentially, it's telling his life in reverse as it's pulling all the stuff done. And it's a little mini film where it's stuff that's going back into the Second World War and the Nazis and all of this stuff and the death of his wife and the drowning in the pool. But it's all done in reverse. And it's way more touching and serious than something for a silly movie had any right to be. It's got a heart and a poignance to it. It's got a whole slew. Brian Blessed, they were talking about him, and Timothy Dalton, and the guy that plays the main villain in the Clytus in the Black Mask. You never even get to see him because he's all behind stuff. But he has a very resonant voice, and there's an awful lot of really wonderful little bits in it. It's surreal and strange, and the music is very effective because all you got to do is do that bum 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 flash, center of the universe, and it just boom right in your head. You can't get it out of your head.
Yep. Yeah.
Anyway, we're zipping back on. I suppose I should.
What happened? Okay, alrighty. How?
Tangerine Dream. I know them from just a few material, and the other one, Vangelis. Vangelis did a lot of electronic scoring. I think the one about the Olympic movies in the 1980s. Something of Chariots of Fire, I think it was. Da, 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 da. And it kind of was a sudden craze of music simulating an orchestra bit, which kind of had its quick little heyday. But it was a new thing then. Tangerine Dream, I seem to think, was the one that did the score for a few films, but I think they did the one for the American release of Legend, which was not the best movie ever made. That's Ridley Scott. I'm a great lover of the idea of rock musicians who move into that cinematic mode. And probably the one I regard as the most interesting one here is Danny Elfman. He's just a crackerjack in terms of his musical knowledge. And I would love to see him hook up with a director who was aggressive enough that would let him unleash his inner dissonance, which he only does occasionally. There's an awful lot of musical conservatism. There's only one person in the room at the moment. It looks like Kevin disappeared. But raise your hand if you like musical dissonance.
Actually, wait, who is? Wait, who? Do I know Kevin?
I wasn't sure who that might have been, but he was in here for a moment and then disappeared and didn't say anything. Yeah, they did Legend. Tom Cruise is the forest boy Jack, AGS pointed out. There's a whole story about that because the movie was originally filmed with in a slightly different version and with a score by the great Jerry Goldsmith. And that's not the version that was released in America, and that's not the version Tangerine Dream score. And that popped up when Ridley Scott was a showing of the film for the various executive staff at the studio, who by that time were a bunch of 20-year-old pot smokers. And they apparently were all high as a kite, and they didn't like the cut at all. And suddenly Ridley Scott got this panic attack, did a revamp of the story, and commissioned Tangerine Dream to do the music for the film. And they had like 10 weeks. They just had to rush it, which is not a thing you want to do. And anyway, the DVD version of it, I think the Blu-ray maybe as well, but I only had the DVD one because it's not my favorite movie. Ridley Scott was trying to be Jean Cocteau from Beauty and the Beast, which you may have no idea what I'm talking about. I bet. Yeah. Jean Cocteau it was a surrealist from the 30s and 40s. And he did what I regard as the classic Beauty and the Beast film from 1945, France. In French subtitles, blah, blah, blah. And it's his surrealism in that and in Orpheus, the film he did after that, are dreamlike and fabulous. And we got to have a whole conversation about that. Anyway, Ridley Scott was trying to do a homage to that, and he is not a surrealist. He's a meat and potatoes director. He's a very grounded type, and the dreamlike quality that Cocteau could do in his sleep, frankly, was not the forte. Anyway, Tangerine Dream, it's a mixed score, frankly. There are a few cases. It's fun to watch the two versions of the movie, because on the DVD, they've got both the European version with Goldsmith score and the American version with Tangerine Dream. And there's a couple scenes, Tangerine Dream served the film better than Goldsmith did. Not many, but there are some moments in there where they actually did a remarkably good emotional content. I think some of the stuff, the one thing I really had to complain about, that poor, the actor that plays the devil in it with those monstrous horns and all that, it's fabulous visual, but he's buried underneath that makeup and he's had his voice altered. The Tim Curry, that you're not making use of him properly. That's the same problem in the remake of the Beauty and the Beast that was just on live action.
You're the one that came out last
year? Yeah, just a couple years ago. I managed to see that at a friend's house. And,
yeah, I haven't gotten to see that one yet.
Very lavish, opulent. It's fabulous cinematography. It's not a bad movie.
I'll have to see it. I do need to see it.
It's basically the stuff from the original music, and I'm a middling fan for that. The composers, they write pleasant professional singer songs, but they're not terribly memorable scores. But anyway, the guy playing the Beast, all the digital makeup and stuff, and his voice is altered to have this kind of animal-y sound. And he's got a really good voice, but you're losing his intonation that way. And I love the fact that in the Cocteau version, you hear the actor's voice direct, and he's under makeup, and the makeup is extremely memorable, and it is very evocative in the way that the film does. So there's a teaser for you for that. Anyway, back to damn Franz Waxman. I'm not going to let you off the hook without you knowing more about Franz Waxman. Waxman then he moved over and did work all over the place at Warner Brothers and at Paramount and all different studios, Fox. He would just be farmed out from one place to another. He didn't have a single home, but he was one of the master orchestrators of music. He loved classical music. He conducted it. He knew it inside out, so he would make use of things. And there's one perfect example. There was a whole series of tell you something unusual. There's a thing called a record. And in the old days, music came out on records. And there was a series that was done by a guy, and a lot of it's available on CD now and that, so it's not a problem. But Gerhardt, and he did a series of ones where they were doing homages to these, where he said, this stuff is really neat music. Imagine if you heard it in a modern orchestra in stereophonic sound as you would be if you were recording it today. So he went through and redid stuff like The Bride of Frankenstein and a lot of these things with modern recording techniques. And you're going, oh, this is neat shit. There's a silly little movie, Prince Valiant, that was done at 20th Century Fox. It's from the comic strip, which is probably way too old for you because this was way back in the 40s and 50s. And it was about Vikings running around in medieval England. And it was made into a movie with, oh gosh, he's still knocking around. He's an actor, I can't think of his name at the moment. He was playing Dassault's dad in NCIS. Anyway, I'll think of his name eventually. But anyway, he's a wonderful old character actor now. He
played whose dad?
Donoso's dad. He was the kind of the con man dad. I can't think of the guy's name. He pops up. You'd recognize his face instantly because he's still active playing a kind of sharp character parts. But he was a young stud, early, handsome guy. Rodford Redford type.
Robert
In the
Wagner.
early 90s, very much. And anyway, I was married to what's her name that died. See, my brain fart on pulling names out of my hat. That's what happens when you get older. Anyway, the music for this basically light pot boiler that 20th Century Fox did. They got James Mason as the villain, so it's worth that for anyway. But anyway, it's a forgettable film in many ways, except the music. And Waxman wrote this gobsmackingly clever Richard Strauss on steroid score that is so good that just as a standalone suite, you can listen to this music and cherish it and enjoy it. And you'll remember all the scenes from the movie and all that. It was fabulous stuff. Anyway, he did the music for the Philadelphia Story back in 1940. And there's a film again with Jimmy Stewart. You could do a whole history of motion pictures with just all Jimmy Stewart movies because he was in Philadelphia Story. Waxman, when Frank Capra did a homage to the Spirit of St. Louis and what's his name, Flying the Atlantic, and Jimmy Stewart played Lindbergh. And this music, this exhilaration of flight, this sense of the peril as he's going across the Atlantic Ocean, it's just a fabulous score. Waxman never wrote bad music in all of the movies that he did. And I think the last movie he did, and I think he won an Oscar for it. It's certainly nominated. It was for Airport in 1970, which launched a whole slew of airplane blowing up movies in the 1970s. It helped launch the disaster movie craze of the 1970s. It all started from Airport. He wrote this fabulous score for that. So if you become a cinemusic buff, Franz Waxman is one of those characters from the golden age, from the 1950s and 60s, and that should always stand in your mind and must sound like ancient days to somebody where a 1985 movie is an old movie. But we had better film music in those days. The scoring of music is loud and Hans Zimmerish. You get a lot of that. And Zimmer, when he's on his game, can be very clever. He's good at orchestration, of mood setting, but he will tend to try to do operatic scoring, which is wall-to-wall music. And that's not an easy trick to do. The masters of the score in their era, Waxman to some extent had an operatic trait, but Bernard Herrmann was not an operatic style composer. He would just put music where you needed it, only there. Jerry Goldsmith, until he got John Williams disease in the 1980s, would use very sparing music in a film, but he would use it tactically, carefully. John Williams was really a bad influence, a great composer, but he was a bad influence because he revived the operatic film score. And it now became the standard model. Oh, yes, R.J. John Williams, yes, Paranoia, yes. I admire John Williams, and when he's on his game, is stupendous. Oh, Paranoia says, I picked a bad time to give up amphetamines. That may be referring to Airplane. Now, Airplane, that is, yipes.
Yeah, I've seen that one. I saw Airplane. Yeah.
Oh, yipes! It's easier because my brain just gets into messes on things to find out who. Oh, yipes! I can't find it where it is in my video collection. It's the guy that did the music for the Ten Commandments. Oh, yipes! It'll occur to me in a minute. Anyway, that was
the music for the Ten Commandments.
Yeah, I think he did the score for Airplane, and then he went on and did Ghostbusters. Oh, yipes! I can't think of his name. Yipes!
It is play. Oh,
I'm trying to think of where the hell I put my Airplane movie. I was just trying to hunt around to find out where I'd stuck it, and then it disappeared. It was probably in a series of things. Wait a minute. Oh, I bet it's. Oh, here we go. Let me see if I was right.
Elmer Bernstein.
Elmer Bernstein. Yeah. That's he wrote really powerful music in the 50s and 60s, and then the music style kind of changed, and he sort of fell into eclipse. And so when he was doing Airplane, he was he could do work. Of course, the movie that really put him back on the map was Ghostbusters. And he was always a very inventive, clever composer. Yeah, Elmer Bernstein. But yeah, his first big hit was the Ten Commandments in 1956, where he was still kind of running in that Bible and sandal epic music quality. He was kind of learning his trade at that point. And then later on, he found more of his voice. Probably one of his masterpiece scores is The Great Escape. Magnificent Seven is an Elmer Bernstein score. He's very, very riveting themes and very effective orchestration. Eat Meal, hi Eat Meal, you're one of my people who has read my damn books. So at least that's you're in that rarefied little bit. But when RJ goes off on film, it's a long haul. Back to Hitchcock. There's a gear shift for you. Hitchcock movies have you seen, Jackson?
Not very many. I've seen. Okay, so we talked about Rear Window, Man Who Knew Too Much. I saw one. I can't remember the name of it, but there was this old woman. It was black and white. It was an old woman who was like a secret agent, and she
that could be The Lady Vanishes. That's a possibility.
Maybe, but like you think she gets like shot at one point in the movie, but she comes back at the end and she's playing the piano.
Yeah, was it set aboard a train a lot?
Yeah.
That was probably The Lady Vanishes. Yeah, that was one of his ones that he made in that early 1930s bit, and then he got to be so well known. David O. Selznick, who was thinking to branch out, hauled him over to America to film Rebecca, which was the super duper mystery suspense love romance novel that everybody knew, and he decided to talk Hitchcock to come over and film it. And this was a weird relationship between him and Selznick, because Selznick was a control freak and Hitchcock was a control freak. And it was an odd relationship that they had. Selznick would be sending memos down constantly on every little micromanaging thing. And Hitchcock, of course, pre-planned the movie and please leave me alone, I'm doing it. And literally, Selznick would barrel down to the soundstage to try to micromanage, and Hitchcock would stop immediately and for tea, and he would stop the whole film production while there was going on until Selznick left, and then he would immediately go back to making the movie. So they had a very odd relationship, but Selznick taught Hitchcock a lot about how to construct movies. That he would be begrudging about it, but he really became a better filmmaker under Selznick. And Selznick taught him, first of all, the narrative arc. Long dramatic relationships. You need to have more emotional attachments in the story. You need to think through the dynamics of not just the puzzle pieces, but the emotional content. And he really learned a lot from Selznick. And so in a film from this period, Rebecca is interesting, but a film that he did during this period under Selznick Notorious. Here you've got Ingrid Bergman. You're familiar with Ingrid Bergman at all?
Ingrid Bergman?
Oh, well, if you think Grace Kelly is beautiful.
Let's see. God. Said Ingrid Bergman?
She's the mother of Isabella Rossellini, the actress and movie director now. And she is, Ingrid Bergman never gave a bad performance. She is drop dead gorgeous. She could do comedy. She could do drama. She could do both in the course of like 5 seconds. She is the most extraordinary one. And Notorious is just a staggeringly clever, fabulous performance. Hitchcock also loved playing around with skirting the rules and seeing what he could get away with. He knew down to the gnat's eyelash what would tick the censors off. And he would plan out a script, initially what he wanted, and then he would put in the scenes that he knew would tick the censors off so that they would get ticked off, negotiate away those scenes so that he would end up with what he wanted to begin with. And they would pay no attention to the stuff that they were sliding under the radar. And one of the rules was that you couldn't have a kiss that lasted longer than 20 seconds. Against the rules. Breen office would go ballistics. So he had a scene that goes on for minutes But they come in, and Ingrid Bergman and Cary Grant are doing a kiss for like 5 seconds, and then they pull away, and they're talking with each other, and they're almost cuddling, and they're looking into each other's eyes, and then they would do another little kiss here for about 3 or 4 seconds, and then pull away. And this thing goes on as the camera is following them and following them and following. The whole thing is as sensual as all get out, but at no point is there ever a kiss that lasts longer than just a couple fractions of a second. He loved doing that. Loved doing that.
Huh. Well, I've actually got to go, unfortunately.
Oh, okay. We've been chit-chatting for quite a bit of time on here, and we're boring everybody probably to tears because RJ on the films.
Well, I've been enjoying it. I think everyone in the chat has been enjoying it.
I'll say this before shutting down. Look at some of these old damn movies, and especially if you have a DVD player, you can at least get the DVD version. If you got a Blu-ray player, try to acquire the Blu-ray of some of these old Technicolor movies and films that were done in fabulous black and white cinematography, that you will be gobsmacked at how beautiful they were and how artistic, the music, the dynamism of it, the performances of things. Almost any Hitchcock movie is worth of this, and see Philadelphia Story and The African Queen and the Lion in Winter. Oh my God, where Katharine Hepburn won her 3rd Oscar. Holy shit. That was the only divided Oscar in Best Actress history. She won at the same year as Barbara Streisand did for Funny Girl. They both carried home an Oscar that.
The other...
And
I did see 7 Wives for 7 Brothers. That's another one I can...
about that. It's a well-crafted movie. Definitely you want to see it widescreen.
I thought it was cute.
It's pleasant, but kind of a schlunky plot. It's I've never been a really great fan of the various performers in there. They're all good actors, but they're not scintillating. It's got some occasionally good songs, but a lot of it's just filling in. But if you see it widescreen, the choreography and the dance numbers are often very infectious. But for me, it never quite gets above 3 on the emotion meter. And for me, the classic MGM musicals, the 2 super duper ones are Singing in the Rain and the Bandwagon.
I've seen Singing
in the Rain. Singing in the Rain, first of all, and the Bandwagon both have an advantage that Seven Brides and Seven Others doesn't, is because it's got a script by Comden and Green. It's a brilliant comedy independent of the music. You could take every song out of it and you'd still have hilarious comedy, but you've also got the very powerful music in there. And ironically, Singing in the Rain is what's fascinating about it, because it's not a plot musical. The whole essence of Oklahoma and the kinds of things that Seven Brides for Seven Brothers represents is the thing where the songs tell the story. And Singing in the Rain isn't. It's from the old holdover days from the 1930s, where you have a plot with a bunch of little dangling songs. But the script is so ingenious how you go into the songs that you don't realize that it's just a set piece musical. And it's got just everything does perfectly. And for me, in addition to the leads, you get to see Debbie Reynolds in her very first musical role, and you get to see Gene Kelly and all the wonderful Donald O'Connor. But don't forget Gene Hagen's Lena Lamont. This hilarious bit. The whole subplot of the story, of course, is about the early days of sound, when a lot of people who had voices that were not for sound had to do sound movies. And so the gimmick is that you've got this Lockwood and Lamont team that do these terribly emotional and dramatic pieces. And Gene Kelly has no problem speaking, but will say, "Okay, now we're ready to film. What is this? Is something wrong with my voice?"
Oh yeah,
and it's just like fingernails on glass. It's just on a blackboard. It's just, what am I, dumb or something? And it's just a classic routine.
Yeah, it was really great. Yeah, I really enjoyed that movie. I was also thinking of another one. There's a movie, I can't remember the name, where it's like the daughter of this guy who's like a millionaire. She runs away because I think he tries to like marry her off. And she meets this guy.
Black and white movie?
Yes.
Oh, I think that's Frank Capra. That's oh my God, with Claudette Colbert and Clark Gable. It Happened One Night.
There you go. I like that movie. I like that one.
It was badly remade many, many years later. Don't even bother with the remake. But yeah, that was one where it took everybody by surprise. Frank Capra was on a roll in the 1930s. He had like back-to-back multiple Oscars again and again and again. And of course, he's the guy that did It's a Wonderful Life in the 1940s, which was a failure at the time and is now regarded as one of the greatest movies ever made. And then another one that he made during that period that is just a masterpiece is Lost Horizon. It's not a comedy. It's where the term Shangri-La comes from. It's about the issues of war and civilization and culture and magic, and there's a whole bunch of stuff going on. And you get to see Ronald Colman and Spock's mama from the old Star Trek series, Jane Wyatt, extremely young. My God, she must have only been 18 when she did that movie. And it's got an absolutely breathtaking score, one of the first big film scores from Dmitri Tiomkin, who would then write tons of fabulous music from the 1950s all the way down to his death in 1970. It's available in a performing version because the movie was big cut down of it. It was over 3 hours long, and studios didn't like 3-hour movies in those days because they were hard to market. And so they cut it down substantially, and for many years there was only that version known. And then they started to discover more and more of the film, and they found the full soundtrack at one point. So the version that's currently available is a performing version that's the full length of the movie with the known film footage and then the miscellaneous stuff they've captured, often on very poor prints that were just 16 millimeter off prints. And then in some cases, still pictures that were publicity stills that relate to the scenes, but you no longer have the scene. But you get to see the whole full length film. And it's one that is just a mood. There's the thing where Ronald Colman is about ready to leave Shangri-La, which is a place where everybody lives preternaturally long. And it's a world of absolute peace and tranquility. And he's going away with his jerk of a brother and this girl who they're trying to rescue, they think, from Shangri-La for reasons that the story becomes clear. And anyway, the funeral of the High Lama is going on, and there's this wonderful music going on, and he's looking back, and there's this yearning theme, da, 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 da. And does he stay or does he go? And he finally goes, and you realize, no. The music is just incredibly powerful. And that was one of those that Gerhardt did as a performing version where he re-recorded it in stereophonic sound, of which it'd be fabulous if they ever did a proper remaster of the movie, that they would like to use that remastering rather than the music that was written, that was done in the 1930s audio recording, because boy, the scoring was just stunning on it. Anyway, I see I've kept you even longer, bastard.
That's okay. That's all good.
Yeah, okay, well, we'll shut down in here. And yes, he has to leave. I realize that, Paranor. And we all got to cut out. We're going to be on there. Thank you very much for joining the after show and listening to my prattling. And any of you out there, I'll do a brief can rattle. Check out my website. I've got books you can buy. I've got GoFundMes you can help. You can become a patron. I'd like to be able to afford to someday buy a headphone so that I can be a real live talker on the internet the way we should be, because he's got one. And thank you very much. Au revoir. Thank you for listening.